The wind clawed at the valley, flinging shards of snow across an endless white silence. In the middle of it, a dog lay curled into himself, half buried, as if the storm was trying to erase him from the earth. His fur, once a shield, was matted with ice, his ribs pressed sharp against his skin. Each shallow breath rose like smoke, fragile and fleeting. He lifted his head now and then, as if listening for something that never came. Footsteps, a voice, the sound of belonging. But only the howl of winter answered him back. No one knew how long he had been there. Days, perhaps weeks. Adrift in this frozen exile, hunger gnawed at him. Loneliness ached deeper, and still there was a faint ember in his eyes, a stubborn flicker that refused to die. It was the look of a soul waiting for a hand that might reach through the storm, for the moment when everything could change with a single act of kindness. The world was a blinding white, the kind of cold that swallowed sound, swallowed breath, swallowed memory. Snow had been falling for hours, maybe days. It no longer mattered. Beneath a skeletal tree that offered no shelter, the dog curled into himself, a fragile coil of fur and bone pressed against the frozen earth. His paws, cracked and raw, twitched with the remnants of dreams he no longer believed in. Once, those paws had carried him through fields alive with color, through the warmth of familiar voices. Now, they trembled just to keep hold of the earth that wanted to take him back. The storm was alive. Each gust of wind lashed across his body like a whip, filling the hollows of his fur with ice. He tried to lift his head, blinking against the sting of snowflakes that clung to his lashes. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow moving in the distance. But it was only the storm playing tricks again, weaving shapes from silence. The dog lowered his head back down, pressing his muzzle into the thin patch of snow, free ground his body had warmed, if only slightly. His breath rose in faint wisps, dissolving before they could reach the air. Hunger was a deep, hollow drum inside him, beating against ribs that pressed too sharply beneath his skin. He hadn't eaten in days. No scraps, no half-rotten finds, nothing but a few mouthfuls of snow that burned his throat with cold. Still, there was something more unbearable than hunger. Loneliness. The silence of it, once. There had been the brush of hands, the sound of laughter, the kind of warmth that came not from fire but from belonging. He did not know when that world had ended. Perhaps he had been left behind. Perhaps he had wandered too far. Perhaps no one had thought he was worth finding. The snow thickened. His ears twitched at every distant crack, every whisper carried by the wind, but no voice came for him. His body shuddered as another wave of cold sank through his thin frame. Instinct told him to rise, to move, to keep fighting. His muscles strained, pushing against the weight of exhaustion, but he barely managed a stumble before collapsing back into the drift. A low whine escaped his throat, carried off instantly by the storm. The sound was pitiful, but it was also a prayer, small, broken, but stubborn. Darkness pressed at the edges of his sight. His eyelids grew heavy, the snow piling around him as though the earth itself was tucking him away. He fought to keep them open, blinking rapidly, his eyes searching for something, anything, that could keep him tethered to this world. And in the blur of storm and silence, there was the faintest flicker inside him, an ember, hidden but not extinguished. A memory of warmth, perhaps, or a refusal to surrender to the nothingness that waited. The storm roared louder. The tree branches above him groaned, brittle under the weight of ice. The dog shifted weakly, curling tighter as though making himself smaller would shield him from the world's indifference. The snow covered more of him now, until he looked less like a living creature and more like a forgotten mound. But if one looked closely, if one truly stopped and saw, there was movement, small, shallow breaths, the faint rise and fall of a chest that still clung to life. Time had lost all measure. Minutes, hours. The fall of night, it blurred into a single endless ache. Yet within that ache, he endured. Alone in the vastness of white, the dog lingered on the thinnest edge between life and surrender, his body faltering but his spirit whispering, "Not yet, not yet." The snow kept falling, relentless and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was to come. The storm had not broken by morning, but in its fury there were pauses, moments when the wind seemed to draw breath, letting the snow fall in softer sheets. It was in one of those lulls that a figure appeared at the edge of the valley. A man bundled in a heavy coat, scarf pulled high over his face, trudged forward with the wary rhythm of someone who had long learned how to move through winters like this. His boots sank deep, each step marked by a crunch that disappeared almost as quickly as it was made. He hadn't come looking for anything alive. His cabin sat farther up the ridge, and with firewood running low, he'd set out to gather what fallen branches the storm hadn't already buried. The forest was quiet in its desolation, the kind of silence that could trick you into thinking nothing had ever lived there at all. But as he moved, something tugged at him, some prickling on the edge of awareness. He slowed, turning his head against the gust. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement, a twitch against the snow. He nearly dismissed it. Out here, the eye often lied. Shadows played tricks, and the wind carved shapes where none existed. But he stopped, squinting through the blur of white. There it was again, a shift subtle but real. His heart thumped once, heavy. Against every sensible thought, he left the trail of his footprints and trudged toward it. The closer he came, the more his chest tightened. At first, all he could make out was a lump of snow pressed against the base of a tree. But then he saw it, a flicker of fur, a breath stirring the frost. He froze where he stood, boots sinking. It was a dog. For a moment, he simply stared. The animal lay crumpled, half buried, its ribs shuddering with fragile breath. The man's throat closed. He had seen strays before, plenty, but rarely one so far gone. And yet, its eyes, they opened weakly, blinking against the storm, locking onto him with a gaze that cut straight through the blur of snow. There was no bark, no growl, no strength left for anything like that. Just a silent plea. A look that asked without words, "Will you leave me too?" The man dropped to his knees, the cold biting through even the thick fabric of his trousers. His gloves trembled as he reached out, brushing snow away from the dog's face. The fur was stiff with frost, the body frighteningly light beneath his touch. For a long second he hovered, doubt clawing at him. Could the dog even survive the walk back? Was he already too late? The storm answered with another gust, slamming against his back. He shielded the dog with his body, instinct overriding hesitation. He could not walk away, not with those eyes still fighting, still waiting. He slipped his arms beneath the frail frame, lifting gently, as if the creature might shatter if held too firmly. The weight startled him. It was almost nothing, like lifting bones wrapped in air. The dog whimpered, barely audible against the wind, but it was enough to drive the man to his feet. He pulled the animal close against his chest, tucking him under his coat, feeling the faint tremor of a heartbeat against his ribs. His own breath grew ragged as he turned toward the ridge. Each step was a battle, the snow heavy, the dog fragile, his own strength stretched thin. But the thought of setting the animal back down was unbearable. He pressed forward, each bootprint carving a lifeline into the snow. The forest seemed endless, his lungs burned. More than once he stumbled, catching himself with a grunt, shielding the dog from the fall. The animal's head lolled weakly against his chest, ice melting slowly into his coat. "Stay with me," the man whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words reached past the storm. Just a little longer. The climb grew steeper, the wind sharper, but the cabin's outline appeared through the blur, a dark shape against the white. Relief surged through him, almost buckling his knees. He pushed the door open with his shoulder stumbling inside. The warmth hit him in a rush, firelight flickering in the hearth. He laid the dog gently onto a blanket near the fire, kneeling beside him. The creature's body shook violently as warmth began to reach him, the tremors of survival, not surrender. The man stripped off his gloves, running bare fingers over the matted fur, whispering low words that were more for himself than for the dog. "You're safe now. You're safe." And in the stillness of that cabin, broken only by the crackle of fire and the ragged rhythm of shared breaths, something shifted. Two lives, one battered by the storm, the other hardened by solitude, had crossed paths in the white silence, and neither would leave it unchanged. The fire snapped and hissed, tossing sparks upward like fragments of stars. Its glow painted the walls in shades of amber, casting shadows that danced across the worn wooden planks of the cabin. On the blanket near the hearth, the dog lay curled in a fragile bundle, his chest rising and falling in unsteady rhythm. Each breath was a gamble, a question whispered into the silence, would there be another one after it? The man hovered nearby, kneeling on the rug, his rough hands restless. He had fetched a bowl of warm water, dipping a cloth and wringing it out, then gently pressing it against the dog's fur. Ice melted slowly, releasing clumps of frost that had clung stubbornly to the animal's coat. The smell of damp fur filled the room, earthy and raw, mingling with the tang of wood smoke. He worked in silence, the only sounds the fire's crackle and the faint, uneven sighs from the dog. Now and then, he paused, his palm resting lightly against the narrow ribcage. He could feel how thin the animal was, each rib distinct beneath the skin, the body trembling as though every ounce of energy was spent simply existing. A part of him feared he was only easing the dog's final hours, that warmth and care had arrived too late. But then the animal stirred, just slightly, pressing his muzzle deeper into the blanket, and hope flared like a spark catching flame. The man rose and crossed to the kitchen corner, where a pot simmered faintly on the stove. He ladled broth into a shallow dish, bringing it back to the fire. Kneeling, he set it within reach, then dipped his fingers into the liquid, lifting them to the dog's mouth. At first, nothing. The animal lay still, eyes half closed, caught in the haze between exhaustion and surrender. The man waited, patient, murmuring low encouragement. Then, just barely, the dog's tongue flicked, tasting the moisture. The man's breath caught. Slowly, painstakingly, the dog licked again and again until he was lapping tiny sips from the man's cupped hand. It was enough to loosen something inside the man's chest. Relief, fierce and unexpected, rose like a tide. He let out a shaky laugh, quiet and almost disbelieving. "That's it," he whispered. "That's it. You're not giving up yet." The hours passed in fragile increments. The man fed the dog spoonfuls of broth, stroked his fur dry, and covered him with layers of old quilts. Each time the dog shifted, a faint whimper escaping, the man startled, rushing to check his breathing, his heartbeat. The storm still raged outside, battering the windows with waves of snow. But inside the cabin, another kind of storm was being fought. The slow, painful battle of a body learning to live again. When exhaustion finally claimed him, the man dragged a chair close to the hearth, refusing to sleep too far away. His head drooped forward, but his hand stayed near the blanket, fingertips brushing the dog's side as though tethering him to the world. In the flickering firelight, the dog's eyes opened briefly, heavy and uncertain. He turned his head, just enough to rest it against the edge of the man's boot. The gesture was small, nearly imperceptible, but it pierced deeper than words. Morning came in muted light, soft gray spilling through the frosted window. The storm had lessened, though snow still lay deep and silent across the land. Inside, the dog stirred with a little more strength, lifting his head to sniff the air thick with wood smoke and the faint aroma of oats cooking on the stove. His eyes, dulled but watchful, found the man. For a moment, mistrust flickered there, an instinct carved by whatever had left him abandoned. But as the man approached slowly, crouching low with steady hands, the fear did not rise into panic. It hovered uncertain, waiting. The man extended a hand, palm open, voice soft as falling ash. "Easy. It's all right." The dog's nose twitched, whiskers brushing his skin. Tentative, fragile, but real. Then, as if deciding something unspoken, the dog laid his head back down. Not in flight, not in rejection, but in wary surrender. The man let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached for the dish of broth again, placing it within reach. This time, the dog leaned forward on his own, tongue dipping weakly into the liquid. Each sip was small, but each one a victory. The cabin grew warm with rhythm, the fire's heartbeat, the dog's breath steadying, the man's quiet movements as he tended. Yet beneath it all, there lingered a knife edge of uncertainty. The dog's body was frail, the damage deep. Survival was not promised, but survival was being fought for. And in that fight, both of them, man and dog, were no longer entirely alone. Outside, the snow lay heavy across the valley, blanketing the scars of the storm. Inside, near the hearth's glow, a fragile bond had begun to take root, shaped not by words, but by firelight, by hands that refused to let go, by a life that had not yet surrendered. The days that followed unfolded like a fragile dawn, slow, hesitant, but steady. The storm outside loosened its grip, leaving the valley wrapped in silence, snow heaped like forgotten graves along the trees. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned without pause, its glow carving a world apart from the winter beyond. The dog lingered near that fire, stretched upon blankets the man kept layering, as if to build a fortress against the cold. Each morning began the same way, with stillness, the man watching, waiting for the faint rise of a rib cage, the shallow pull of breath. And each morning it came. The simple miracle of survival. Food was introduced in cautious steps. First broth, then softened morsels of meat, small enough to coax but never overwhelm. At first the dog turned his face, uncertain, instinct warning him against trust. But hunger gnawed deeper than fear, and slowly, painfully he began to accept. Each bite was an act of courage, each swallow a reclamation of life. The man would sit nearby, hands resting on his knees, voice low and steady. "Good boy. That's it. Take your time." It was not just the dog learning to trust. The man found himself watching more closely than he had watched anything in years. He counted each swallow, memorized every shift of weight, measured the pauses between breaths like a prayer. His life had been marked by silence long before this storm. Days in the cabin spent in solitude, chores done without urgency, the fire tended only for its necessity. Yet now there was rhythm, a reason for attentiveness. He realized, with a start that unsettled him, that he had begun speaking aloud more often. Not just words of encouragement, but fragments of his own life. Lost the roof once, back in '93. Wind tore it straight off. Spent 3 nights under a tarp till I could fix it. You wouldn't have liked that storm either. The dog would watch him through half-lidded eyes, ears twitching at the cadence of his voice. It was not comprehension, not fully, but there was listening. And the man who had grown used to speaking to no one found himself grateful for it. As strength returned in inches, the dog began to shift. One morning, as the man bent to lay a dish of water, the animal pushed unsteadily to his feet. His legs trembled, paws slipping against the rug, but he held himself upright. The sight struck the man with unexpected force. He knelt quickly, steadying the frail body, murmuring encouragement. The dog stood for only a breath before collapsing back into the blankets. Yet that single breath was enough. It was proof. Tomorrow might hold more. Day by day the proof grew. A few tentative steps across the room. A lift of the head when the door opened to let in the sting of winter air. A tail still thin and ragged, twitching once, as if remembering how joy felt. Each moment was small, but the weight of them was immense, tilting the balance away from despair and towards something resembling hope. There were setbacks, too. Nights when the dog's body shivered uncontrollably, when coughing racked his frail chest, when the man lay awake in the chair beside him, afraid of what morning might bring. On those nights, he would stoke the fire higher, tuck the blankets tighter, whisper promises into the still air. "You're safe. Stay with me." Whether the dog understood or not, it hardly mattered. The words kept the man anchored as much as the dog. In time, fear loosened its hold. The dog began to venture farther, nose pressed to the cabin's wooden corners, testing the limits of this strange new home. Once, he stopped at the door, sniffing the cold air that poured in through its cracks. The man crouched beside him, hand resting gently on his back. "Not yet," he said softly. "Soon. When you're ready." The dog did not push forward. He turned instead, leaning his weight briefly against the man's leg. It was the smallest gesture, but it hollowed the man's chest with emotion. Trust, fragile as glass, was forming between them. Not demanded, not rushed, but earned in hours of quiet patience. The man felt it in the weight of a head resting on his knee, in the steady gaze that met his own without flinching. And for the first time in years, he felt the walls of the cabin not as a prison of solitude, but as a shelter holding something worth protecting. Winter stretched on, relentless. But inside, life was blooming in increments. The dog's coat began to soften, the gaunt lines of his ribs less stark. His eyes, once dulled by exhaustion, now carried light, cautious, but unmistakable. There were mornings when the man awoke to find the dog already sitting up, ears pricked as though awaiting him. And there were evenings when the silence was broken not just by the fire, but by a low, contented sigh as the animal settled closer. The man would watch him, and in that quiet, something inside his own solitude began to mend. He had not realized how lonely he had been until loneliness was interrupted. Now, in the rhythm of feeding, tending, walking short circles inside the cabin, he found himself tethered again, to time, to care, to companionship. The slow bloom of tomorrow was not sudden, not dramatic. It was built from hours of patience, from fragile steps forward and nights of fearful watching. But it was real. In the heart of winter, against the white silence of the storm, something alive had begun to grow. And as the man sat one evening, stroking the softening fur of the dog who now rested without trembling, he realized the truth. It was not only the animal who was healing. It was himself. The first time the door opened to let them both outside, the world was still wrapped in winter. Snow lay heavy on the ground, draped over trees like frozen waves, sparkling faintly beneath a pale sun that had finally broken through the clouds. The air was sharp and cold, but no longer cruel. It carried a quiet that felt less like silence and more like peace. The dog hesitated at the threshold. His paws hovered over the wooden step, nose quivering as he tasted the wind. This was the same air that had once buried him, the same cold that had pressed him to the edge of death. His body remembered. His muscles stiffened, tail lowered, ears flicking back. Behind him, the man crouched low, one steady hand resting against his side. "It's all right," he murmured. "Not the same as before. You're not alone now." The words lingered, carried by the breath of the day. The dog lifted one paw, set it onto the snow. It sank lightly, pressing a perfect imprint into the surface. For a moment, he froze, then, slowly, another step. Then another. The man rose beside him, boots crunching alongside the smaller tracks. Together, they walked into the light. At first, the movements were tentative. The dog's legs, still lean from hunger's long grip, wobbled beneath him. Yet he pressed forward, nostrils flaring, eyes scanning the vast white expanse. A crow wheeled overhead, its cry echoing sharp against the silence. The dog's ears pricked, head lifting with something like wonder. He took another step, and another, until suddenly he was moving with more certainty, paws carrying him through the drifts. His tail gave a twitch, then almost shyly, a single wag. The man's throat tightened at the sight. They wandered together across the ridge, man and dog leaving twin trails behind them. The man carried no leash, no tether. He didn't need one. The dog glanced back often, each time finding him there, and each time stepping forward again. The snow that had once threatened to swallow him now seemed to glitter as if welcoming him back. When they reached the crest of the hill, the valley opened before them, a vast sweep of white and shadow, dotted with dark evergreens. The man stopped, breath curling in the air, and the dog moved to his side. For a long moment, they stood in silence, gazing out at the land. To anyone else, it was only snow, but to them, it was memory. It was where despair had lingered, where survival had been tested, and it was the place where a life had been found again. The dog pressed closer, his body warm against the man's leg. His eyes lifted, meeting the man's gaze with something clear, unspoken, but certain: gratitude, belonging. A promise that this bond was not temporary, but carved into the marrow of their days. The man knelt, resting a hand against the dog's fur, his fingers sinking into the softness that had once been matted with ice. "We made it," he whispered. His voice cracked, but the words held steady. "You made it." The dog leaned into him, eyes closing for a heartbeat. Then, as if some dam had broken inside, he bounded forward, small at first, then faster. His paws scattered snow into the air, his tail lifting high, his body moving with the reckless joy of freedom. The man watched, laughter breaking from his chest. Raw, unpracticed but real. The sound carried across the ridge, mingling with the rhythm of paws against snow. For a moment, time loosened its grip. The valley was no longer the place of near death but the stage of rebirth. The dog circled, darting back toward the man, leaping into the drifts with a playfulness that seemed impossible only days before. His bark rang out, hoarse, unused, but vibrant. It echoed off the trees, chasing away the memory of silence. The man crouched as the dog returned, flinging himself into the circle of his arms. Snow clung to fur, melted against wool, but neither cared. They stood together in that frozen expanse, two lives stitched together not by chance, but by choice. The choice not to walk away, not to surrender, not to let the snow have the final word. As the sun lowered, painting the horizon in strokes of gold and rose, they turned back toward the cabin. Their footprints trailed behind them, weaving side by side through the snow. And though the cold still bit, though winter would linger, it no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply the backdrop to something greater. Inside the cabin, the fire awaited. But in truth, the warmth was no longer just in the flames or the quilts or the wood smoke clinging to the air. It was in the bond forged between man and dog, in the silence that was no longer empty but shared. That night, as the dog curled at the hearth, his breathing steady and strong, the man sat beside him, watching the flames. Outside, snow fell again, quiet and endless, but this time it was not erasure, it was renewal. And when the man finally closed his eyes, he did so with the certainty that the storm had not taken but given. In saving the dog, he had saved himself. The snow fell on, soft and patient, covering the valley where once there had been despair. Now it blanketed something new, something alive, enduring and warm. The snow eventually melted. It always did. Though in those long weeks of winter, it had seemed endless, like a white wall that would never lift. But spring arrived quietly, almost shyly, with small rivulets of water carving paths down the ridge, carrying the remnants of ice into the valley below. Green pressed itself stubbornly through the thaw, fragile shoots that bent beneath the frost at night and stood straighter in the morning sun. For the dog, now no longer just a creature but a companion with a name, Ash, the change of seasons was more than a shift in weather. It was the arrival of a world he had nearly lost. A chance to stretch limbs once too weak to carry him, to feel earth rather than snow beneath his paws. His fur had thickened, his body had filled out with strength, but what struck the man most was the light that had returned to Ash's eyes. They no longer held only survival, they held curiosity, mischief, even joy. The cabin, once a place of silence broken only by the crackle of fire, had become alive with sound. The thump of paws against the floorboards, the soft whine at the door each morning, asking to run through the meadow, the bark that startled the man the first time he heard it, sharp, sudden, but full of life. Each sound rewrote the house, turning its emptiness into something like a home. The man found his own rhythms changing too. Where once he might have risen only when the sun warmed the windows, he now woke early, nudged by Ash's wet nose against his hand. Walks that began as obligations soon became rituals. He would watch Ash dart ahead, nose to the ground, tail arsing like a banner in the breeze. And in those moments, the man felt something inside him unlock, a part of his chest that had been frozen long before the storm ever set in. Summer came, and with it, warmth that loosened the land. Ash swam in the lake, his body slicing through the water with ease, shaking himself dry in great arcs of glittering droplets that caught the light. The man laughed, a sound that startled him at first, as if it had been waiting in his throat for years. Neighbors who rarely saw him began to stop by, drawn not by curiosity of the man, but by the sight of Ash running alongside him, their companionship too striking to ignore. "Didn't think you had it in you," one said with a smile, nodding at the dog. The man only shrugged, but inside, he knew it wasn't he who had found the strength. It was Ash who had given it back. Autumn arrived like a soft hymn. The trees turned gold, the air crisp with the smell of leaves and wood smoke. The man would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching Ash chase falling leaves, leaping into the air as if each were a prize. In those twilight hours, he often thought back to that day in the storm. The weight of Ash in his arms, the question in his eyes. He realized now that it had not only been the dog asking for rescue. It had been himself. Both had been lost in different kinds of snow. Both had needed to be carried. Winter returned as it always does. But this time, it did not feel like an enemy. When the first flakes fell, Ash pressed his nose to the window, tail wagging, impatient to bound into the drifts. The man followed, pulling on his coat, stepping into the same landscape that once held only silence and loneliness. Now the snow held memory, not of despair, but of survival, of the moment when two lives crossed and changed everything. That night, sitting by the fire with Ash curled at his feet, the man felt the kind of peace he had thought unattainable. He reached down, running his hand through Ash's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of breath beneath it. The storm had tried to take this life, had nearly succeeded. But instead, it had delivered him here, into belonging, into love that asked for nothing but presence. The snow fell steadily outside, blanketing the ridge, quieting the world. Inside, warmth pulsed through wood and stone and skin. The man whispered, not sure if Ash was awake to hear it. "Saved each other, didn't we?" Ash stirred, lifting his head, eyes catching the firelight with a glimmer that needed no words. And in that glow, man and dog, once broken, sat whole, no longer alone, but bound by a rescue that had not ended in the snow, but had only just begun.